down. He got two already. Bang is hiding. He's coming. Bang looking to come in. Here comes your initiation. They're right through. Oh my God.
Thunder Shockwave will find them all. And SKT, with a hell of a response, will take down 4.
Hello and welcome to Worlds Tonight as we continue our 2017 Worlds coverage here on into the evening. And we will do so every day after the group stages and on throughout Worlds to cover all of the awesome action. I'm Rivington Business III, joined by Indiana Froskurinn and Black and Isaac Azael Cummings Bentley. And what a better game to start on when we get into them is EDG and SKT. But big picture things to look at. Games are getting a little bit longer here. We kind of see a meta forming, if we didn't already, a bit in Ardent Sensor. But things are starting to shape up here in the group stages.
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting to actually see how these teams are adapting to the meta, how they're fitting their champions into their own playstyle. And while I do think that we are seeing more consistently tanks and that sort of thing in the top lane, we have seen actually quite a few carry champions. We just saw the Rumble from EDG. We've seen Jace top lane from Immortals. We've seen carry performances from Khan. So it's not that you can't play that way.
It's certainly isolated to Group B, however. I do agree with the Rumble point coming through, but unfortunately that game still went late. They got outscaled. Salt in the Wound still hurts, but it's really been about, Flame and Khan and Group B really taking off with a lot of those carry-oriented champions. Otherwise, Ardent Sensor as usual.
Other big picture things to look at. NA coming through the day quite well. Korea starting off, but Europe having a bit of a falter as well as they try to find their footing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's still a lot of hope to be had for the European fans. I think that G2 is their best team. They had their toughest matchup first, right? They did play against Samsung, and I think that there's going to be kind of brighter skies ahead as they do go up against some of their own other opponents, because a lot of these teams really are fighting for second place in their groups against the teams. Like, we know that they're heavy favorites.
Yeah, and in that same vein, even though Fnatic fell down and it was a very exciting game across from Immortals, it was still a very good run from them. So I don't think the EU is boom is 100% accurate. There have been a lot of fight left in Europe.
Absolutely, and I kind of want to go off the point where everybody's fighting for second here as we do kind of get into our first game to look at EDG versus SKT in what even had our room going crazy, and then SKT does what they do best mid-game, but what a start from EDG.
Yeah, it looked so good, and unfortunately I was one of these people who was going crazy, watching these tower dives, watching EDG find the confidence after absolutely getting smashed yesterday by AHQ. I was curious if they were going to come back, if they were going to, get over the mental boom, but then this is right where I sit down.
Yeah, and this has to be one of the best engages I've ever seen from Wolf. It brings me back, I believe it was actually at Worlds last year, his Zyra engage, flashing over the wall, at the Wraith Pit, finding a multi-man route there on Zyra. And this was just something that SKT seems to be able to do no matter what the circumstances. They're able to turn around games. They're always able to find their win condition.
And I'm so happy that you bring up Wolf in particular. A lot of people will look at that play and they'll say, like, man, that shockwave, Faker, of course, doing it again.
How'd the ball get there?
Exactly. But it was all Wolf.
Khan combo is just absurd. And the fact that he's able to do this, and obviously everyone on the SKT is kind of a star, right? But really? I feel like Wolf doesn't get as much credit sometimes as perhaps he deserves. And I know there was some more hype around him, around MSI and whatnot, but it's kind of cooled off because SKT had a bit of a rough summer. But to me, the bot lane from SKT was so ridiculously impressive in this game when mid lane was falling apart, when Peanut was getting bullied out of his jungle, when Huni was getting killed time and time again. I mean, Bang had died only one time, really, in this game, I believe, and it was at the very end, after they had already come back and gotten Baron. Like, the fact that their bot lane was able to stay proactive, was able to stay relevant, up in farm, always being strong, gives them an opportunity to kind of find one of these turnaround fights.
Somebody that did try to put that down was the man in his hometown, Clearlove, playing an amazing early game, bringing out that Rek'Sai, making sure Scout would get what he needed early.
And this is a classic champion for Clearlove. They said it during the cast. He's been playing Rek'Sai even when Rek'Sai hasn't been a thing. Yes, she's starting to kind of swing back, as Warriors is coming back into trend. We saw MLXG also pick it up, I believe, and a couple of other items on the Rek'Sai there. But the nice thing about Rek'Sai for me and LPL teams is how it band-aids or compensates for their lackluster vision control. By having the Tremor Sense there, it opens up so many more possibilities and saves them a lot of the stress of not buying the control wards.
Actually playing a lot of those champions like Lucian in the mid lane that can get caught out if you don't have that vision, those control wards.
Yeah, and especially if you are trying to play aggressively in the early lane, I think that teams still want to play to their styles, and a lot of the LPL teams still like to get aggressive early on. I think EDG has a very strong early game, very powerful laning phases. RNG does as well, and Rek'Sai is someone who can kind of help both with vision control, which is kind of a band-aid for later in the game, as well as enabling you to pull off some of these dives like we saw against Faker and some of the proactive early plays. So I think it is something that's a bit of the best of both worlds.
And obviously, it's kind of up to SKT when they pull that trigger. We saw one mistake at 30 minutes. Froskurinn, I'll kind of come to you with this. No definitive answer, but what would you have seen EDG kind of do different to not be there for that situation or just kind of have a different strategy?
I mean, the mentality was correct there. I believe the middle inhib was down at that point, and so they wanted to push it out because they were trying to draw SKT. They knew that they were over by the Baron pit. Baron had just spawned, so EDG are thinking, if we push this pressure point, SKT will have to come out. But the problem was that they got too close to the other side, they clumped up, and immediately Rakan was on top of them. So the idea was sound, the execution was not.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing to me is you don't just have to think about your win conditions, you have to think about your opponent's win conditions, right? So if you're EDG, they're thinking, great, we need to push up mid lane. Super, you're doing your own win condition, right? Yeah. But what is SKT's only win condition at that point in the game?
Wombo combo.
It's AoE, yeah. It's Shockwave, it's Rakan, it's Twitch AoEing you with his Hurricane and his ult. It's everyone crashing in, and the only way they can actually accomplish that is if you're super grouped up, right? When you have a Janna, if the Janna step back, can immediately disengage that Rakan a combo if she's not actually caught in it, right? But everyone is clumped, everyone's not really thinking, so that to me is the biggest mistake. You have to keep your opponent's win conditions in mind in a game like that.
SKT 2-0 in that group now of A, EDG 0-2 as we move on to TSM versus the Flash Wolves earlier in the day. This started off kind of getting that length in the games up there. A 55-minute game and a very scrappy back.
This one was a nail-biter if you're an NA fan. Everyone's getting a little bit nervous. Hype was kind of going into overdrive for TSM this last week or so. All the interviews coming out from free players and coaches hyping them up. But I think Flash Wolves have kind of shown this weakness where they struggle to close out in the later stages of the game. Whether they get an advantage, they're not always able to play really well with that.
And frankly, if you look across, not even just the Flash Wolves, but all of the LMS teams, I really criticize this from the LMS region, that you can find these big weaknesses even in their top tier teams. And so it makes sense that as the game gets drawn out, pound for pound talent, individual performance, they're just not quite there matching up to the other world-class talent that we have. So in this case, I think it was MMD versus Hauntzer. Hauntzer had, yes, a gorgeous 5-man Gnar ultimate, but there was also the 2v1 outplay on the bottom side. And it's just little things like this, which is why the Flash Wolves really struggle in these post-35-minute games.
And I think one thing that was kind of a really nice sign for TSM is the fact that when you look back to kind of the failure at Worlds last year, right? High expectations for TSM. They flame out in groups. Hauntzer was one of the guys who, to me, did not live up to his expectations. He looked nervous. He looked shaky. This Hauntzer looked extremely confident, right? And there was also kind of troubles in the bot lane, whether you wanted to put that on Della's shoulders or Bifrost, whoever it was, the bot lane did not really perform. And, in this game, I thought Double looked pretty much flawless, right? He was buffering all of the CC coming in on Tristana, able to pull off rocket jumps time and time again. He was putting out massive amounts of damage, never really missed positioning. So to me, the fact that some of the people who didn't perform last year are starting off with such a good game is kind of a confidence booster and something that TSM could build on.
Absolutely. And for Flash Wolves, obviously seeing the end of the game not coming in, what possibly is the resolve for them? They get to these points where they're 5K in the lead. They have the Baron, but the base just is not cracking for them.
I mean, Flash Wolves have always looked most impressive, at least in my eyes, when they're able to close out these early games, when they get these massive snowballs. We saw it at Rift Rivals when Flash Wolves took down OMG in about 20 minutes. Karsa was just going huge, and that's what I expect from the Flash Wolves. Hit hard, hit fast. Their defining feature and why they've dominated the LMS for so long is that they don't play like the other LMS teams.
And you have to say, they are going up against the favorites for this group in game number 1, so although it isn't an SKT or something, it still is the team that most people are predicting to get number 1. I do think that anyone can compete for number 1 in this group, but going up against the Misfits or maybe even a WE, they may be more confident knowing that they almost took down TSM.
And that's actually the biggest takeaway for me. Yes, TSM won the game, but we now see that Flash Wolves are competitive. So suddenly this group becomes full of these dark horses. It's not just TSM, it's Team WE, Flash Wolves, and maybe we even get a better look at Misfits later on.
And we move on to our next game as I'm talking to you guys and nobody out there. I apologize. Immortals versus Fnatic. A game that all of us wish we could kind of hug Reckless here at the end, but another back and forth 50-minute game.
And I mean, this is a very, very close game, and to me, this is kind of almost very similar to the TSM Flash Rolls one,
Right.
in that, you know, one team takes control and they're not necessarily able to actually, you know, get that much done with their lead. I think that Fnatic played extremely well for the early stages. I think that Reckless, you know, really was able to get a big advantage. It looked like he was in full control. He's so far ahead of Cody Sun, but, you know, Pobelter, I think, delayed the game very well, you know, roaming to side lanes and making things happen there. But again, it just feels like some of the teams are struggling with what's next, right? We got a lead. Where do we go from here? They're not necessarily knowing what to do.
Yeah, and I just want to piggyback. I know Reckless is probably going to get a ton of heat for that flash, but if you just looked at that highlight reel, so much of it was Reckless doing everything right. And yes, it came down to that single big clutch moment, and he falls short there. We all saw his reaction, but ultimately, the only reason why Fnatic were really in that game was because of him.
It was absolutely disgusting. I remember getting mad, saying that's the third time he was just camouflaging through mid lane, getting the back line. And where are the wards? Where was the recuperation for it?
Yeah, and it's one of those games where when no one else is making something happen, you start to kind of feel the pressure, right? As the Fed member, Cody Sun is catching up. It was Reckless on 6 items when Cody Sun was on 3 items, right? Reckless is kind of realizing Kog'Maw is catching up. They're starting to scale. Maybe we're going to get outscaled here, and he's trying to make a play, and it's one of those situations where, you know, big players sometimes want to go for that big play, and in this case, it did not work out for him, but it was about 20 minutes of him actually in camouflage looking for those plays, and there was no opportunities given from Immortals, so he finally goes for one, maybe got a little bit impatient, and it didn't pay off.
I mean, it was really the difference that Immortals were able to carry from 3 lanes, you know, Ale, Pobelter, and as well as Flame up onto the top lane, and Fnatic were only really carrying from 2. Broxa had a great performance early on in Lee Sin. We don't normally talk about Broxa as an early game jungler, and Reckless just went huge.
So looking at tomorrow, as obviously groups is going to go on for quite a long time, we have to see how this unfolds as things continue to change. Group D, C, and A will play as B gets a chance to hang out and watch the games. Looking at the first one, we have TSM versus WE. What are we thinking about the matchup?
This is a real rough day for all 3 Chinese teams right now. I mean, yeah, it's TSM versus WE, but it's also Samsung Galaxy as well as Cloud9.
Yeah, I mean, TSM is a game that I think a lot of people are going to be looking up against because, you know, WE and TSM both coming off wins, both actually looking for one of the top spots in this group. And, you know, we saw how they matched up against their specific opponents today, but seeing how they actually go up against each other will give us a lot more insight into how the group is going to shake out.
And looking at how EDG has kind of gone back and forth this game against Cloud9, do we feel like NA can actually continue a bit of this dominance with just continued win streaks?
EDG versus Cloud9 is probably one of my favorite stylistic matches. I mean, we saw how dominating Scout was today against Faker and how much attention he got from Clearlive, you know, multiple ganks into that lane, but that's normally not EDG's MO. Normally, it's the 8-minute gank bot, which we've now seen in both their games. AHQ, they attempted it, it went wrong. This time around against SKT, they didn't get the tower, but it went much better, but that's kind of the staple standard. 7-8 minutes, EDG will be bot lane. And they need to do that against Cloud9 for it to be successful, because I don't think ganking Jensen, I mean, yeah, it worked against Faker, but Contracts just camps that lane.
Yeah, and Smoothies off in there, Impact's off in there. It is the lane that they most like to play through. So it'll be interesting to see, not only because of that, but to me, all the NA games have kind of gone as expected, if you want to say that, right? Day 1, NA goes 0-2. Well, guess who they were playing? They were playing against Korea, right? And I think that although they weren't heavily favored in the matchups today, I do think that most people had them as the favorites in all 3 of the matchups across the board, and they came out as expected. When you go into a matchup like C9 versus EDG, that's more of a wild card matchup, I think, and while people do probably have EDG as the favorite most of the time, like, it's hard to know, right? Because which EDG shows up? Is it the EDG that almost beat SKT, or is it the one that, you know, lost to AHQ, which didn't look very good? And I think that that's what it gets really interesting in these groups when you see these matchups, which really are kind of more 50-50.
And see, here's the thing. I know that there's been a lot of back and forth between like Team WE. I stand firm that Team WE are the actual strongest team from the LPL. And the reason why is that word that you just brought up, consistency. We don't know what iteration of EG we're going to get. We don't know what iteration of RNG we're going to get. But Team WE will play the exact same game every single time. So if I'm a betting man, I bet on Team WE.
Yeah, I guess the question this becomes, is that exact same way every single time good enough to beat the top teams, right? And at the end of the day, that's what Worlds is about. It's about finding which teams are the best. And I think that this is going to be a very interesting year. Yes, Korea is clearly the favorite, but we've seen that they are, like, they can be attacked, right? They can.
Can they?
Yeah, I think they can. I mean,
Not a-
I remember that wombo combo.
Yeah.
I'm like, ooh.
but let's be fair, right? If that's pretty much the only way they can come back, and they do find it. But I do think we will see Korea drop games. I think that they have shown vulnerabilities. Immortals outpacing Longju in the early steps of their game was one in. This was actually much closer to actually completing the game here with EDG against SKT. So I do think we will see them drop games. The question is kind of just when and against who.
I think we even heard from Pobelter himself in those leads, feeling that pressure is you almost feel like you don't know what to do next. You're a little too timid because of the fact that SKT and these teams can come back in one fell swoop and just make the play happen.
It's a single mistake, and it's effectively, we know that gods bleed, but do we know if gods can die?
I mean, it's the X factor, right? It's anytime you're playing against Faker, anytime you're playing against these guys, people talk about playing with nameplates off, but I think that's almost impossible to do when you know you're sitting across from the greatest team in League of Legends history and the greatest player probably that ever will be, right? This is just something that's always going to be in the back of your mind, and I do think it changes the way teams play, and I do think it changes the way that you approach the game.
Yeah, and I want to really touch on that last part. It changes the way that teams play. When you face across from SKT, it forces you to play perfect. And so a lot of the times, you'll get these two extremes. Either you're just going to get smashed, you're going to get stomped at 20 minutes, or you actually will get the greatest performance that you've ever done in this massive spotlight.
Well, those nameplates are going to be back on tomorrow as we continue the group stages right here in Wuhan. Do not miss it. Thanks for tuning into Worlds tonight, and we'll be sure to catch us tomorrow for the games.